Thank you so much, Brian. And I'm very grateful to Carmen Morton Christensen Foundation. It's a great opportunity to be here. And we've had such a really good 3 days. It's a workshop that is unlike something that I've done before, even though I've done a lot of 3D printing workshops, because the machine that Brian got is different from the ones that I've worked with. And I don't really talk about that in my presentation much, but I work with primarily DIY versions of clay 3D printers, and this is very much not that, which is great. And we learned all kinds of stuff and tinkered around, and it was really enjoyable. So thank you to Brian, Ernie, and everyone in ceramics and everyone else who I've met who's been coming and going. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope that we can continue the conversation. And I'm always there to answer questions if you have them. So, yeah, of course, we'll always have questions. So, maybe we'll do this. White is my background, so maybe that'll be enough light. Okay, so as I get started here, I did something to the screen. I'm not really sure what I did. My computer is acting up, and I'm saying that it's acting up because it knows it's about to be replaced. It's got some problems. So I'm actually going to talk about 3 things today, and in some ways it's these 3 things. I'm going to talk about technology, prosthesis, and material practice. But I'm also going to talk about a framework that I think about. My brain, I guess I feel like I cram a lot of things in there, and I think about a lot, and it's always kind of always bouncing around in the way my work is manifest. So I'll talk about that, and hopefully that will make sense when you start to see my work. And so then I'll talk about kind of the core of my work, which was really directly asking these questions. And then the third thing is mostly things that are ongoing. And I guess I'm finding that the farther I go, the more open-ended everything seems to be. So all of my current projects just seem to be ongoing. And through the course of this, I hope I'm able to convince you that in some way you all are technologists, and just by way of one example, I think that understanding clay as a material and all of its firing methods is a really profound technology in and of itself, let alone every other way that we think about and work with material. So, I didn't solve this. Okay, go to slide. All right, I think I got it now. So, this framework that I was talking about. If we begin our journey with this, and we just start with technology, and we ask ourselves the question, what does this actually mean? Well, it means a lot of things. It doesn't necessarily just mean this device and everything that's current. It's actually the sum of all of the ways that we avail ourselves as social groups of material objects, information, and how that sort of plays out in civilization. And if I do maybe a disservice to the history of all of technology in just a few slides, I think about ways that we already understand ourselves in our history. We define certain eras of humanity by way of our relationship to materials. So if we just look at this, we think maybe the ceramic material, not so much as an age, but as a thing that's really indelible to ourselves as humans. We can maybe just understand ourselves this way, right? And then maybe we'd be done with technology. But as time has gone on, some very interesting things have happened with enough time and development that there are certain tools that cross thresholds. And I think in the case of these tools really act as a signifier of a shift that is from, in many cases, our sedentary lifestyle that points to a really weird incremental removal of the body from direct experience, direct use. And the plow is one example. Here on the left, a machine that reduces our need to use our legs to transport our bodies and materials and things around, which is pretty profound. And the thing on the right that magically simulates experience for us and it brings it to us without us having to go there. This change is not trivial to our bodies and how we experience the world and how we think about ourselves in the world. And a further interruption of all of that direct experience comes with other tools, like machines that can process large quantities of numbers and information, ones that allow us to communicate with our voice by proxy, that mobile device there. From strictly enhancing our senses, like our ability to see or hear, to enhancing really broader things, like machines that record our memory with video. The early 20th century filmmaker Hollis Frampton referred to film as the last machine because of how profound he thought that sort of reliving of experience would be. And our ability actually to travel and to understand outside the earth, which, by the way, requires a completely prosthetic environment for our bodies or a prosthetic skin, is another example of that. It's Camus who said that humans appear to be the only species that refuses to be what we actually are. So, these technological things, sometimes simulations, enhancements, augmentations, etc., they're actually a lot more than our bare faculties can process or comprehend. So that requires an order of magnitude more kinds of calculations than our base 10 number system can handle. But it allows us to manage infinite new references to the body in interesting ways. And of course, this is at the core of how we think about the digital world, how digital technology operates. And it's about on-off, 1-0, positive, negative, push-pull, and all these other binaries. But binary constructs, while they may be helpful when thinking about me and my sister Mel, way back in the day, my mother was really prefiguring my interest in pattern, and this really exemplifies how I think we're just beginning to culturally understand how binaries are really failing. They don't help us understand gender or really our identities or our bodies themselves at all. But about the failing bodies or failing understandings of our bodies, we have limitations, right? So let's start with that. In order to reconcile our limitations, we, like in terms of physical strength, we have to develop these clever strategies to exhibit mechanical advantage over things that are really heavy that we like to move. But all of these kind of mechanical advantages can also point directly back to the body, which reminds me to throw this word out there, which is something I thought a lot about in grad school, and I don't think I had a very clever understanding of it, but I thought about it really broadly, and I thought about all technology potentially as a prosthesis, not just ones that are addressing real needs, like replacing limbs in the subcontinent of Asia, but other kinds of prosthetic solutions, like in terms of physiological function, perceived shortcomings. And so this intersection between the body and biomechanical prosthetics sets up another construction of push-pull, biological, synthetic, flesh, metal, plastic, silicone, familiar, and canny, a lot of kind of push-pulls. And then one last thing I want to posit for you about materials, maybe some false binaries or at least some false comparisons. I like to think about this a lot, and I like to ask the question, where do you see more clear evidence of human handwork? Something like the French formal garden or an 800-year-old bonsai tree, which is just very small and long view and very deliberate manicuring. Something like the site at Petra, Jordan, or Taguna huts built by the Dogon people in Mali, or a place like downtown Singapore, which is just insane to experience. But in terms of materials, we think about this form which was sculpted and then cast. And does this show the evidence of human handwork on its own? This is St. John Nepomuc on the Charles Bridge in Prague. Or is it actually the perfectly polished surface from centuries of touching and devotion at the base of the statue? Which is more evidence of the human hand? Is it a Peter Voulkos stack like this? Or is it similarly constructed by hand, the work of Magdalena Dundo, or Sun Kuyu, or this one of my favorite pieces by Alice Mackler, or the Finnish fetish work of Ron Nagel. So, my work is somewhere in between all of those things. So, at the end of these questions, I think about how to make responses to it, and about questions and tensions. And so, this questioning for me was really a hopeful act, and it's an attempt at explaining systems of the body that can't quite be engineered the way we think that they can. Like when someone close to you dies from a complication that the doctors are unable to fix or engineer their way out of, like multiple organ failure. We may develop systems that allow us to analyze, look, see, and maybe understand our vision, like the link between our eyes and our brains and how the visual cortex perceives them. But sometimes, no matter how impeccably constructed, utilized, or adjusted, we can't exactly understand. Maybe we could adjust it in a way that could help us to understand. How we're able to solve these problems of the body, we have to maintain, and so sometimes we wish we were able to see better or to act wiser. And these technologies might help to alleviate, say, the arduousness of work. Who owns one of these things? Which is a metaphor for finding a comforting and comfortable place where things might just fit, where our bodies might feel comfortable, and it might be palatable, like in a color that might provoke a kind of nostalgia for the room, where I remember hearing through thin walls my parents fighting, which is a thing that taught me about imperfection and relationships. That might be a metaphor for things I encounter throughout my life. This piece has this little life force when the objects are close together. And so I think about this piece as an example of how things sometimes want to come together, but despite certain life forces, they never can quite do it. Interestingly, we're carrying around this amazing piece of engineering already. And sometimes we actually need to understand our bodies in ways that, about maintenance and fixing. But the interior space is really hard to get to, so we invent these really beautiful ways of seeing, from X-rays, like this example, to MRIs, and ways of looking that are increasingly complex. The thing that's most fascinating about these ways of looking is that it's about discrimination. So when you look inside the body, you can't sort of see everything at once. You need to kind of sort by density or type of material and look at certain parts, but not the whole thing at once. So we preference what we want to look at. And so I have used this kind of way of looking and asking in the interior of the body space as a kind of metaphor for looking and looking to fix. And then back to the question of ability to see. Myopia is a really beautiful metaphor, which is questions about vision and wisdom as a function of our physiology. And they're juxtapositions of things like machines that we invent, like in that bottom drawing, inventions to see things infinitely far or infinitely tiny. Things that our bare faculties can't see, our eyes just can't see this. So we invent ways to be able to see it, but that doesn't actually alleviate our need to understand the complexities of what we see right in front of us, the people that we see every day, and things that are at our actual own scale. And so a lot of that work kind of seems like machines that want to move, and there was one example, but because body moves, I've been increasingly interested in this, and so I find that we often build funny contraptions or constructions that are about ourselves and synthetic replacements for things about ourselves, but that might actually be fragile. And even when things work as we wish, like in this piece, this is the thing, okay, it's not too loud, constructions that are hopeful and willful acts to maybe make things newer and better, but in this sort of transcending the limitations of our body, these extensions are tenuous, a bit ridiculous, and they create new problems for us to solve. Like this little lazy boy footrest thing, for lack of a better way to explain it. Sometimes you just have an idea in your head and you have to do it. And then it takes you 7 months. But technological progress in these contexts, I think, is so conflicting. And these technologies that we invent, do they make us comfortable, or do they actually make us vulnerable to our own tinkering? So are we vulnerable even when we avail ourselves of 10 sets of opposable thumbs and fingers instead of just one? And so in this chair, we're kind of acting like operator, but maybe we're operated upon. And so these collateral problems, we have trouble identifying. Like here, this sugar is referenced as a food technology, food engineering to its end. But the implications are new terrible diseases about lifestyle, or at least the kind of leisure that makes us less well and more susceptible to needing to fiddle with our bodies and reconcile these complications. So, taking a breath for a moment, maybe we can look a little deeper and a little closer into some technological questions. And I've really been thinking about the relationship between resolution and authenticity and authorship. We're in a reproducible world, right? And so resolution specifically reminds us that it's possible to understand the body in terms of resolution and information, but we similarly can't count that. It's very difficult to see and understand with our bare faculties. And then what does it mean if the body has resolution? Our building blocks are resolution, right? It's this thing that we sort of understand about ourselves, but we can't see them without tools or simulations. And with our genes being code, I often wonder if this justification of our increased human desire for information and data is related to this. The human genome, this being my human genome, you're welcome to a copy of it if you'd like. It's 3 billion base pairs, right? So this DNA is code, but biological replication of this code includes errors, which is why we all don't look the same. We invent machines to eliminate errors, even though they're beautiful, profound, accidental art making. And this precision, which is what we seem to want our digital world to be, is a desire maybe to reconcile our own finite existence, which is a really weird way for us to live, I think. But maybe it's also why this line-by-line 3D printer code, which is the DNA of 3D models and their output, maybe that's why it looks like this. Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe we understand our genome because this is how we want to think. And so our bodies don't see these tools or experience them with our bare faculties, but seeing them in this way, or at least thinking about and understanding them, is really, it's about a new kind of transformational disruption that the human body is just beginning to experience and understand. So back to this beginning of sorts and thinking about resolution and simulation, I set out to explore these 6 simple machines as ideas of form. And so I modeled them simply and quickly, and I've been thinking about them as technological prototypes. So this is kind of a regression of form and ways of working and technology brought back to building blocks, right? The originals in this case became a product of the eye of the machine through this laser scanning, and then stored digitally, and then became a kind of virtual invention. So the objects are there, and they're the idea of it, but then also its preservation. So there's an image and then a scanned representation of the thing. Then it's reproduced in a kind of prototyping material, a mold made, and then in a final permanent result in vitreous porcelain. And the porcelain form is for the viewer to trace the marks of the hand, so you can see the finger marks and the marks of the tool that made the prototype are overlain into a new kind of surface. And these 6 machines in their forms should, of course, remind you of some things. One, really obvious one, would be the way we understood Joseph Kosuth's questions about the authenticity of things and how we know and understand them, invoking language, an image, an object, which is about our world right now. But it's also a Immanuel Kantian idea of our inner and outer selves and our understanding of the world. So Kant thought about formal things that are understood as something spatial or temporal, but material things are always understood with our senses, right? We understand our senses with, like, touching. And so with this project and the last iterations of these objects, it was a return to a synthesized remaking of the forms where I was using my whole body to kind of retrace the marks. Scaled up, the finger marks require a different part of the physiology to simulate. And so that was an exploration maybe of looking at objects over time, but this is a very common way of understanding history, very common for people who work in ceramics, people who work in vessel traditions. This is how we look at the making and remaking of history across millennia. And so I've worked on a couple of projects that were asking questions about ways of understanding spatially, temporally, and with the senses, but also how this way of looking could maybe generate new meaning through multi-layers of this reinterpretation. Thinking about old and new tools, thinking about the hand maybe as an old tool, and digital processes and new tools. And so in this first collaborative project, Mapping Authorship, the potter Sean Spangler, who's a friend of mine, were asking questions about this, like looking at history and remaking objects. So we took this, a pivotal moment in industrialization and globalization as they became faster and faster at the end of the 19th century. And we chose this piece on the left, this Christopher Dresser vase, and an object of his fascination, which is this Chimu stirrup vessel. Christopher Dresser was perhaps the first kind of industrial designer for hire. He did a lot of work in ceramics, and he was really interested in disseminating objects to the masses. He may have been a designer for IKEA, perhaps, if he was a contemporary. And he looked and relooked at objects, and you can see this in his work. And you can see where he's working with iterations of form and surface. He's got references to Japanese decoration, pre-Columbian, European decoration. It was kind of a 19th century mashup, the way we kind of think about the way our references do that now. So it seemed like a good starting point for us. And so we worked through iterations of form using digital processes to kind of scan and decrease the resolution of each object to see if we could find a place through a kind of morphology if they might come together into one kind of object. And then that translated to the tools of output. So the piece on the left in this series is it's actually me mimicking the kind of layers of construction that a mechanical tool might use, but it's just done by hand with slabs. The piece all the way on the right is actually done with that mechanical process, but in a changing orientation. And making a whole lot of these things and iterations of objects, the work sort of became a landscape, or it was cartographical, or like the dendritics of trees, or like cladograms, genealogies, all those ways of thinking about the progression of objects through time. And this for us was like a spatial map of the authorship of the objects, which is a shape of time across the boundary between maker and remaker, showing variation in the original, sometimes a small amount of variation with some mechanization, and sometimes lower digital resolution, but then in this case a reflection of their histories. They're a literal reflection of the history. And so this exercise in authorship and like asking questions about it really suggested convention and invention at the same time. And for us, that also brought up questions about potential and waste, about good results and bad. And we thought about the past coming alive into new things, but also the future as eventual archaeology. Like actual excavation, like milling these digital forms out of foam. It's like a future archaeology, where these forms are excavated. But it's also about useful versus useless iterations of forms. So this, like a dross pile or a shard pile, is actually just whole complete forms. So there's potential, they're building blocks, they're not broken. They're about, they're highlighting potential and cycles of making and pointing to the future. So maybe in the end we weren't really sure we kind of knew the questions that we were asking, but we weren't really sure what we were getting. So we kept looking at this process, but we realized that the tools were one of our primary limitations, keeping us from working in a way at the same time that would have allowed a different level of intuition and play. So on this next project, which was at the University of Hawaii, we similarly took a series of objects, in this case 3 of them, from the John Young collection at the University of Hawaii. And then we digitally reproduced them as precisely as we could in a surface that's like so polished and refined that they're reflective of each other. They could see each other in the reflection of the other, but also the form kind of disappears. When things are really reflective, it's almost as if you can see everything but the thing because of how it reflects its surroundings. But again, that revelation in this work was about 3D printing, and this is the point where I had built my first extrusion clay 3D printer. So the digital process output was the same material that we would use throwing on the potter's wheel or building by hand. And that allowed us in the studio to just make parts of things, to be really fluid and improvisational, to make a couple of responses to even parts of forms or parts of ideas, and then just kind of mash them up and start stacking and playing and seeing what could happen. And so we worked on each one of these pieces from beginning to end at the same time in the same studio through the wet, through glazing. And so each of these objects was a literal assemblage by the both of us. So the process was like the beginning of a form, the beginning of an idea, direct or indirect references to history or to sort of contemporary things that we were seeing. And they eventually became these enigmatic studies where some of it was about process, the form disappears, we kind of get far out to sea. Maybe it's because with this project I was in Hawaii, I was maybe feeling a little landlocked or some island fever. Definitely felt out to sea. And so each one of us would finish a part, drop it off in each other's studio, and then we respond, build, and continue. Remake, remix, fuss, and tinker. And then we exploited things like misregistration of the machine, an accident, and cutting things apart, all in the interest of looking for some new things. And we were really happy that some of the results looked like things we were familiar with, but some of them weren't. And that's a good place to be sometimes. But then our most recent project is really kind of a culmination of it. I don't know if we were kind of saving this term for this moment, but this was a real sort of increase in number and scale of objects that became edited, but again, it was about looking at the past, looking at the future, thinking about tradition, and thinking about new ways of being. We actually started from the places where those two previous projects were, and we brought them together. We scaled up certain parts of form. We worked with more iterations and followed aberrations maybe farther down a dead end. So some of them are quite aberrant, but also some of them are quite refined in their kind of weird geometry or their odd textures or proportions. And yeah, some of these were dead ends. I guess that makes me think about, in terms of genealogies, is like extinction moments in a cladogram or in evolutionary biology. But also discoveries, like the interior space here, and use of color and hand line. So this project I'm ending on the hand line because sometimes the complexity of space and form requires me to take a few steps back. And so from time to time, I really like to ask more simple questions about containers and pottery forms. And in this case, I've been thinking about two-dimensional lines, both looking down on a shape and across at a profile, as a way of understanding pottery forms, but also as a way of understanding drawing. And so I've worked with series of hand and kind of mathematically generated drawn lines that again are two-dimensional, but that have the potential to create volume into space and things that I might not be able to imagine some other way. This came up in our workshop today. So two versions of the same scribbled line, which is just a scan of a Sharpie on a piece of notebook paper, can be digitized, manipulated, pushed through an algorithm, and then a kind of space is lofted in an object. The space between both of those lines is a kind of new territory and something that I don't see until the object comes out of the process. So relationships can slowly change by stretching and pinching sections of lines. So going from a kind of circle form to these intersecting loop-de-loops that can then be stacked, and converting these lines into stacks of lines. They're like floors of a building that kind of lead to a metaphor of an architecture of space in the objects. And so the algorithm constructs this space, and the interior and exterior facade is like a kind of fictive architecture. And so this video is familiar to those of us from the workshop, but this is what that modeling environment looks like. And so some of it is really visual in terms of its output, and some of it is about visual organization of the data. So that's the result. That's a shot in the kitchen at Northern Clay Center. And so with iterations of all these relationships in scale and proportion, they're like scale and proportion to the body because they're pottery forms, they're objects that we might hold and we engage with a certain part of our body, but I continue to think about them as architecture in the way it's sort of upending our relationship between our body and space, the contents, the interior, the exterior, and things that we might want to inhabit. They become kind of models of things that we want to be inside. We occupy the interior space of pots metaphorically, of course. So, I'm now at the point where I'm going to talk about my ongoing projects. And so this first one is a bit of a somber start, and it could be a much longer story, but I think it's acceptable for me to just say that my family history, like the history maybe of some of you in this room, was disrupted by the unspeakable things that happened in the first half of the 20th century in Europe. And so I have been looking to appropriate from my recent travels to Hungary, which is the place that my grandparents left with my infant father through all of that social and political upheaval. I've been looking to construct objects that have been lost in this time and distance. So using digital tools, I've been interested in how still photographs, something called stereophotogrammetry, can be used to make digital 3D models, to capture and appropriate objects that you wouldn't be able to have and to hold in another way. And a lot like the way people travel and take photographs as memories, this is a way to take objects as memories and to maybe become heirlooms or artifacts or souvenirs. And so my first attempts to do this were really challenged by my desire to produce some slippage between that digital data that I captured and I can hold on to for the rest of eternity, but to make something that was kind of faithful to the kind of failing goal of holding on to things that way. So this like continuous gesture line is this scribbly, noodly search for a way to reproduce the form that's captured in that digital data. And so these are constructed physical artifacts from loss, and I feel like they really kind of capture a cloaking of all of that data, where the specificity of what was desired is gone, but something else is kind of over top of it or in its place. This, which is a scan from this tiny China-painted porcelain cup that had a bird on its handle, and the bottoms of its wings and its tail feathers were broken, and my father's cousin keeps it in this cabinet, in this glass cabinet with a rubber band holding these chipped off, broken pieces in place because she's afraid to put tape on it. And so this reproduction is a way to give that a kind of new form and to have and to hold it in a new way. But all that information, too, is about drawing and drawn line. And so this project, the first iteration, was me kind of looking to conflate the space between biological and mechanical movement. And so this drawing is all the digital data kind of flattened and turned into drawn marks. It's drawn with a CNC machine, a mechanical drawing machine, but also half of it's hand-drawn by me, and I'm not going to tell you which half is which, because my goal was to just search for the relationship between the two of us and the space between the two of us through the process of doing it. It's kind of like all of our technological endeavors, really. Or this piece, which is on the poster, is a scan from a memorial, a World War I memorial in the town of Kiskun-Felicháza, which I'm proud that I'm able to say, which is where my father's mother, my grandmother's family was from. And this monument has my family name engraved on it. And it's a real fitting representation of the ultimate absurdity of the conflict that was the result of this diaspora, but also this rifle, which is a representation of technological power against the body, here is represented as something flaccid, frankly, and powerless. And that cloaking is really evident in this figure. So these artifacts become artifacts of interpretation, and they're really holding on to maybe the way language holds meaning and memory, and a complete fabrication, but new fabrication of artifacts from this search. So this is ongoing, and it's very personal. So I've been thinking about ways to also extend this to other kinds of histories, and some of them personal, but some of them more kind of universal. So the ongoing histories are also fabricated histories. And again, to remind you of this scanning process, there's this noise in the background that comes from the algorithm knowing what you're looking for. So this is from the scan is from 2013. This is a really old version of this kind of algorithm, but you can see there's like buildings in the background and these like chunks of data that you would discard, right? But I found it really fascinating to consider the object of my interest and what I was throwing away and what was actually being invented in this scanning. And so as a way to understand and formalize this discarded data, this has kind of become an index of the artifacts, and I'm not entirely sure where it's going, but they're somewhat geological in the same way that they're kind of reminiscent of digital. Excuse the cut and paste from this version of the presentation. The piece on the left is actually a scan that was in the background of that stereophotogrammetry example that I showed you. Actually, they both are background artifacts from that, just tiny little nuggets that I stole from it. The second ones are not from that scan. These are both actually from the scan of that tiny porcelain bird mug. The rest of that information is incorrect, apologize. Okay, we're back to correct information. But in this looking and thinking about other histories, I also thought of further ways of becoming familiar with the data and understanding it in different ways over time. So this is that mug more fractured and more cloaked. And this is a fragment from the top of the last remaining Soviet monument in Budapest, which is like a kind of architecture of form and explorations of color and surface. And this a morphology of all that immutable information. So this is another version of the angel on the top of the Millennium Monument in Hero Square in Budapest. And this, where the objects at times feel kind of hauntingly like bodies, like this reproduction from a scan of the plaster cast, the plaster cast specifically of the cowering body from the site at Pompeii. If you're familiar with that, remember those plaster casts that were made from the bodies that perished in the pyroclastic disaster. Or this object, which reads as a symbol, or maybe an ancient emoji of some kind, was actually from the ruins of the Colossus of Constantine, which is in the Capitoline Museum in Rome, which is a real beautiful symbol of the collapse of empire. And it makes me wonder whether this relates to anything happening in our world today. This, which is from the bust of Medusa in the Vatican Museum. And the idea of Medusa made me think about the way humans are constantly reminded of what incredible things we can do, which is why we're astonished at things. And astonishment means turning things to stone. Literally. And even simple shards of pottery found among rocks and rubble in the ground tell us of our histories, our collective histories, and of our material technologies. This was from a kind of rogue scan when I was at the site at Pompeii. In Rome, if any of you have been there, you know there's literally shards of ceramic everywhere that you look on the ground. But at Pompeii, there was this beautiful wedge-shaped, sort of pizza slice-looking shard of pottery that I just set up on a little kind of wad of dirt and digitally scanned and reproduced. It also looks a little like candy corn, which I'm okay with. I'm back to this thing because I think I wanted to end by just saying that this technological power against the body, this flaccidness, it really makes me get back to ways of understanding technology and actually believe that technological pursuits and our sort of weird desire to push technology forward, that it's about hope. It's a hopefulness. Technology is a really hopeful act, and it's a way of trying to reconcile ourselves against all the perils of our bodies, about the perils of time and the perils of space. But this hope as a rigorous act can maybe feel really burdensome to some people, and I think technology makes us feel that way. But technology is at its worst an obstacle actually to us understanding ourselves. But maybe at its best, it's a promise of hope in this regard. And it's a way of working to resolve all of these questions about infinite things and our finite selves and all the ways we want to really understand ourselves in the search. And that's it.
Questions? In the back.
Hi. Yes.
Get which glaze surface. Some are kind of leaving unglazed and some are really encrusting.
Yeah.
First, like really personal work, I wanted it to be really naked. And you know how sometimes you kind of go down a road and you know that what you're doing is kind of serious, and then something happens, right? It's sort of like when you're like feeling really emotional and somebody makes you laugh. When I first started printing those objects, and I was like, this looks like top ramen. I need to make like a shrimp flavor packet for this thing, you know? I wanted to leave it at that because I like that it was what I intended, but also it like read in really weird ways, and I just wanted to leave it that way. And maybe it was because it was really personal. But then over time, I think I was just really looking for ways of thinking about that kind of cloak and ways of kind of building up the surface. So a lot of it's just experimentation. I mean, I don't really work that way that much, and it's intuitive. There's a lot of loss. You know, with this process, actually we did an example today in the workshop of a really kind of noodly expressive print, and the thing, you know, fell over within 10 minutes of it being done, and it's, who knows, it could just be a mess over there right now, a big pile. And all that work is just like so much about failure and persistence. And in, you know, earlier talks, I think I kind of framed my earlier work as a like over-engineered, like over-earnest in like desire and intention to like figure something out, and maybe that like those layers of color are me kind of pushing that, but in a looser way, in a less fussy way. So I like that. I like that I can just sort of keep working at it and being like earnest at it, and see what happens. Did you read it that way, or did you perceive them as a like a different kind of decision making?
Like coiled in more. There's so
Yeah.
very.
But like,
Yeah, there's nothing in there anymore. Yeah. Oh, the candy corn. Yeah, it's very covered. Yeah, you can see a couple little yellow bits hanging out down there in the bottom. But then there's like, I guess there was a laser pointer, but then like those little strata up in the corner, like revealing a little bit of it maybe is a good compromise.
I think it's
Yes?
amazing the different things that you can see in your work, you know. At the top, that's a woman's hair, and she's spraying, like her hands are up there, but I mean, I noticed in a lot of your pieces, they took on other forms too, which, you know,
Yeah.
that's exciting within itself when you're already seeing something you like and to see.
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think about it a lot. I think about some people ask really deep and narrow questions in their work, and so the output is like about a really profound subtlety and in many ways, that's kind of like the ceramic history thing that I was talking about in the presentation. But for me, I think, not that I'm all over the place, but that I think the output, visually, I think I want to see a lot of different things. And so there are a lot of threads, and I think in my process there are threads, and I hope that I kind of wove that together in a good way. I think all of that, like that framework in the beginning, was maybe like overcompensation for like, why are you doing this now? But yeah, I hope that they all kind of like weave themselves together a little bit. Thank you.
Kind of a technical question. With the scans that you did, did you go to the location, or those were all just pulled? Okay.
Yeah. In a couple of cases, I've crowdsourced photographs, and I used them, but I don't know how much they lent to it. I liked the use of them, but so the question is sort of like, in this process, just to remind you, it's like if you want to scan an object, you just take a whole bunch of photographs of it like this. And then if you go on the internet and you're at like a famous site, you can find thousands or millions of photographs that other people have taken of places that they've been, right? And they're often from different angles. And if you can put all those photographic pieces of data together, you can reconstruct a 3D model. And yeah, there have been some projects that have done that. And for me, I think there also has been a kind of real personal connection to like physically seeing the thing, which has allowed me to get the like firsthand photographic data. Have you experimented with that way of? Yeah. Have you done the crowdsourced side of it?
So no, I touching on it. I was basically doing video, and then I basically spoke to distill images to kind of construct a model.
Nice.
But it was just amazing to me to see how easy it is for the software to actually make a model from just junk photos. And so that's why I was curious to see if you actually just kind of found a bunch of photos on the internet, kind of screwed those together to make a model if you actually were there, because it's crazy that you can't do that now.
Is this something that you have to kind of pioneer yourself? Are you using the same type of programs like Cruiser to slice your 3D models? Does digital clay printing, does it have armature underneath objects that can sustain themselves?
Yes, and yes.
Mostly yes. So, yeah, my process was mostly in the beginning, like the digital part was leveraging existing software and existing machines. And I'm not a coder, but I'm a tinkerer. So, Brian and I were talking about this, I guess maybe yesterday, but in my early work, I think like the machines were the work, but eventually with the extrusion clay printing, the machines became me constructing the tool to make the work. And so that's why I was on the DIY side. So I was using RepRap and the resources of a couple of key people, Unfold, the design group Unfold in Belgium, a guy named Jonathan Keep in the UK, who were like on the real tinkery side of DIY extrusion clay printing, basically just using like normal desktop like MakerBot kinds of printer technology. And globalization, of course, has made these things really cheap. So you can build a 3D printer for a few $100s now, which is just insane to think about. And there's so many resources that you can leverage on the internet that are free and open source. So I've used so many of those resources. And in terms of software, I'm a big advocate for free and open source. However, we kind of become creatures of habit. And I learned to 3D model on Rhinoceros 3D. It's not free and open source, but I still use it. I prefer to use the file preparation software Slicer because it is open source and something about it really aligns with my brain. But we've been using Cura in the workshop, and it has similar functionality, and so I like to use it too. Yeah, it's interesting. I really land on the source, on the side of being a generous source, and then maybe imagining a world where I can also expect that of other people. I have real trouble with certain software companies' business models, for example. And so, but maybe that's because I'm an educator too, right? I teach, and so I don't have to worry so much about a business model as some other people, right? So it's really easy for me to stand here and say that. But in the end, I'm not a pirate, but I love sharing freely with the open source community. And on that note about the workshop, I know I've said this many times, but I have nothing that's proprietary. So anything that I say or do, you can remake 3D models that you've seen examples of in this slide presentation, and I'm perfectly okay with that. And I hope that maybe like this work is a really good example of the kind of weird slippage between the authenticity of an object and digital culture, how it exists right now. Does that get to your question? Okay. I feel like I kind of went somewhere on that.
There's something, I mean, I still have the concept that technology can solve everything.
Uh-huh.
And then the surface application of it looks like it's crumbling.
Mm. Right, so you're reading.
Is a fraud. Maybe. Well, that's a good read. I like that read. I mean, my father definitely is like the generation of like, he's the engineer your way out of everything and everything's going to be great. And I love that promise, and I feel like that's why I think about technology as hopeful. But also, I find myself regressing a lot. Like, I prefer to live in the country. I turn my phone off. I disappear in the wilderness. I do all of these things that sort of insulate me from all of the inundation of those kinds of technological things. So, yeah, I feel like technology solves problems, but I don't know if we're sort of at a net gain or a net loss. And I'd rather kind of be ambivalent and just kind of play in these weird dichotomies. And maybe that is, you know, I'm a Gemini, so maybe that's what's going on, I'm not sure, but.
It feels like the conversation between the two viewpoints.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I really think about the difference between my mother and my father. I mean, my father, he's sitting there and he's just like calculating gear ratios in his head all the time and just, you know, who knows what's going on. And my mother is, she's flamboyant and she sort of thinking in kind of story and lyricism, and they couldn't be more different. Yeah. Yeah. Well.
Other questions?
Yeah. That's a good question. So I think at first, and maybe we're still at this moment collectively, I was really interested in the idea of preserving the end result, because in order to get a kind of digital output, something 3D printed or CNC milled or whatever, it takes a ton of work to get there, and you just don't want to screw it up. You're like, oh, it finally did what I wanted it to do. And so I think I hold on to some of that, but when working in clay, and particularly my collaboration with Sean, we were just like, you know, we weren't so like Volcus expressive in the material, because, you know, it has its limitations in how you can deal with it, like something that comes off the 3D printer. But we were very liberal in terms of cutting things apart and then stacking them together. And in some cases, I think there might have been at least one example where there wasn't anything 3D printed with a machine at all in there. There might have been some noodle stuff, and I often 3D print with a cartridge in my hand, like no 3D printer around. I'm just like squeezing someone was asking about making coils this way earlier, just like squeezing coils into like my hand or something and sculpting it. So I have been apprehensive, but I think luckily like the plasticity of clay allows me to not worry about that so much, because it's pretty cheap, you know.
Your Instagram, I saw like a bunch of your pieces with Sean. Were those made separately then put together, or was it something that he built it through first and then you printed for? What was the process with it?
It was.
Some of it would be like, I would make a whole series of things, and then I would take that wear board and just like put it in front of Sean, and he'd be like, okay, and then he'd make a bunch of things and like stack them on top or like get rid of them, and then he'd make a bunch of things. He'd bring them over, and I would kind of stare them down. And we would just kind of work back and forth. And then sometimes we would print on top of things, or we would build on top of a print. So it was really a lot of back and forth, and really no kind of limits or boundaries. And you know, I'm sometimes a little self-conscious about talking about the source material for that work, because you don't see those historic pots in, like, the farther along we get, the less you see of those references really at all. It's like, what are you guys even looking at? And in truth, maybe we weren't spending a lot of time looking literally at our sources, but we were kind of looking at, it's sort of like the telephone game, you know, where like you say a thing, and then as it goes down the line, by the time you get, it's hilarious, right? By the time you get to the end. So, does that answer your question? Cool.
Thank you.
we can talk after. Thanks, everyone.